John B. Watson, 1878 to 1958. We have discussed several trends that influenced John B. Watson in his attempt to construct the behaviorist school of thought for psychology. He recognized that founding it not the same as originating, and he described his efforts as a crystallization of the ideas already emerging within psychology. Like Wilhelm Wundt, psychology's first founder, Watson announced his goal of founding a new school. His deliberate intention clearly distinguishes him from others whom history now labels as precursors of behaviorism. Concerning John B. Watson's life, Watson was born on a farm near Greenville, South Carolina, where his early education was conducted in a one-room schoolhouse. His mother was intensely religious, his father the opposite. The elder Watson drank heavily, was given to violence, and had several extramarital affairs. Because he rarely held any job for long, the family lived on the edge of poverty, subsisting on the output of their farm. Neighbors regarded them with pity and contempt. When Watson was 13 years of age, his father ran off with another woman, never to return, and Watson resented him all his life. Later years, when Watson was rich and famous, his father went to New York to see him, but Watson refused to meet his father. Watson did, however, turn out to be a lot like his father. The son also, quote, became heavily attached to bourbon, and like his father, he freely transgressed his marriage vows. Throughout his married life, Watson had many affairs with many women, end quote. As a young teenager, Watson was something of a delinquent and a troublemaker. He characterized himself as lazy and insubordinate, and he never earned better than passing grades in school. Teachers remembered him as being indolent, argumentative, and sometimes uncontrollable. He got into fistfights and was twice arrested, once for shooting a gun within city limits. Nevertheless, at age 16, he enrolled at Baptist-affiliated Furman University in Greenville, South Carolina, intending to become a minister, something he had promised his mother. He studied philosophy, mathematics, Latin, and Greek, expecting to enter Princeton Theological Seminary after graduating from Furman. A curious thing allegedly occurred during Watson's senior year at Furman. He said that a professor warned the students that anyone who handed in the final examination with the pages in reverse order would receive a failing grade. Watson took up the challenge, turned in his exam backward, and failed. At least that was how Watson reported the story. Later, an examination of the pertinent historical data, in this case Watson's grades, shows that he did not fail that particular course. His biographer suggests that the story Watson chose to tell revealed something of his personality. Quote, his ambivalence toward success. Watson's constant striving for achievement and approval was often sabotaged by acts of sheer obstinacy and impulsiveness, more characteristic of a flight from respectability, end quote. Another of Watson's professors remembered him as a nonconformist, quote, a brilliant but somewhat lazy and insolent student, a bit heavy but handsome, who thought too highly of himself and was more interested in his own ideas than in people, end quote. Watson's academic record as an undergraduate was not exactly impressive. He only managed to pass the final examination in Greek and Latin in his senior year by getting high on cocaine. From 2 in the afternoon until the next day when he took the exam, he crammed intensively while drinking a quart of Coca-Cola syrup, end quote. Watson went off to graduate school. He remained at Furman but for another year, receiving his master's degree in 1899. But during that year, his mother died, which released him from his vow to become a priest. Instead of the theological seminary, Watson went to the University of Chicago. His biographer described Watson at that time as, quote, an ambitious, extremely status-conscious young man, anxious to make his mark upon the world, but wholly unsettled as to his choice of profession and desperately insecure about his lack of means and social sophistication. He arrived on campus with $50 to his name, end quote. He had chosen Chicago to pursue graduate work in philosophy with the great John Dewey, but quickly found Dewey's lectures incomprehensible. Quote, I never knew what he was talking about then, Watson said years later, and unfortunately for me, I still don't know, end quote. Not surprisingly, Watson's enthusiasm for philosophy diminished. Attracted to psychology by the work of James Roland Engel, the functional psychologist, Watson also studied biology and physiology with Jacques Loeb, who acquainted him with the concept of mechanism. Watson held several part-time jobs in graduate school, working as a waiter in a boarding house, a rat caretaker, and an assistant janitor responsible for dusting Engel's desk. He began to have acute anxiety attacks, periods of intense depression, and a morbid fear of the dark. For a while, he was unable to sleep without a light on in his room. He began taking 10-mile walks in the middle of the night and suffered his first nervous breakdown, from which he gradually recovered. In 1903, Watson received his Ph.D. at the age of 25, the youngest person in the University of Chicago's history to earn a doctoral degree. Although he graduated with honors magna cum laude, he experienced profound feelings of inferiority when Engel and Dewey told him that his doctoral exam was not as good as that of Helen Bradford Thompson Woolley, who had graduated 3 years earlier. Watson wrote, quote, "I wondered then if anybody could ever equal her record. That jealousy existed for years," end quote. That year, Watson married one of his students, 19-year-old Mary X, from a socially and politically prominent family. She had written a long love poem to Watson on one of her examination papers. It is not known what grade she received, but she did get Watson. Concerning Watson's academic career, Watson stayed at the University of Chicago as an instructor until 1908. He published his dissertation on the neurological and psychological maturation of the white rat, research that showed his early preference for animal subjects. Watson said in 1936, "I never wanted to use human subjects. I hated to serve as a subject. I didn't like the stuffy, artificial instructions given to subjects. I always was uncomfortable and acted unnaturally. But with animals, I was at home. I felt that in studying them, I was keeping close to biology with my feet firmly on the ground. More and more, the thought presented itself. Can't I find out by watching their behavior everything that the other students are finding out by using human observers?" End quote. Watson's colleagues recall that he was not successful at introspection. Whatever talent or temperament was needed to pursue that technique, Watson did not have it. This lack may have helped to direct him towards an objective behavioral psychology. After all, if he was hopeless at practicing introspection, the primary research technique in his field, then career prospects were surely dim. He would have to develop another approach. Also, if he followed his inclination to see psychology as a science that studied only behavior, which could be done by experimenting on animals as well as humans, then he could help bring the professional interests of animal psychologists into the mainstream. In the year 1908, Watson was offered a professorship at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. Although he was reluctant to leave Chicago, the promised promotion, the substantial raise, and the chance to direct the laboratory left him little choice. As it turned out, Watson's 12 years at Hopkins was his most productive years for psychology. James Mark Baldwin, born in 1861, died in 1934. The psychologist who offered Watson the job was one of the founders, along with Cattell, of the journal Psychological Review. A year after Watson arrived at Johns Hopkins, Baldwin was caught in a police raid on a house dinner to visit the brothel and see what was done there. "I did not know before going that immoral women were harbored there," he said. He did, however, give a false name to the police and told them he was an official in the United States Treasury Department from Washington. The embarrassment and threat of scandal was too much for the university, which forced him to resign. Baldwin became an outcast from American psychology and spent his remaining years in England and Mexico, and he died in Paris in 1934. 11 years after Baldwin's dismissal, history would again repeat itself. The same university president called for Watson's resignation because of another sex scandal. When Baldwin resigned, Watson became chair of the psychology department and editor of the influential Psychological Review. Thus, at the age of 31, he was suddenly a major figure in American psychology, in the right place at the right time. Of course, he says that the whole tenure of my life was changed. I tasted freedom in work without supervision. I was lost and happy in my work. End quote. Watson was less happy at home, however. The 2 kids are enough, he wrote after his second son was born. He began to pursue an active social life and further enhanced his reputation as a womanizer, not unlike his father. A psychologist who interviewed him wrote, quote, each time that I tried to find out about his work in psychology, what I heard about instead was some woman with whom he supposedly went to bed, end quote. Watson was extremely popular with the Hopkins students. They dedicated their yearbook to him and voted him the handsomest professor, surely a unique accolade in the history of psychology. He remained ambitious and intense, however. Often fearful of losing control, he drove himself to the point of exhaustion. Once again, quote, there were now sleepless nights and periods of depression and illness when the lights were kept on to ward off the demons of childhood, he said. Watson began to think seriously about a more objective psychology around the year 1903, and he expressed these ideas publicly in 1908 in a lecture at Yale University and in a paper presented at the annual meeting in Baltimore of the Southern Society for Philosophy and Psychology. Watson argued that psychic or mental concepts have no value for a science of psychology. In 1912, at Cattell's invitation, Watson delivered a series of lectures at Columbia University. The following year, he published his now famous article in the Psychological Review in 1913, and behaviorism was officially launched. Watson's book Behavior, with the subtitle An Introduction to Comparative Psychology, appeared in the year 1914. He argued for the acceptance of animal psychology and described the advantages of using animal subjects in psychological research. Many younger psychologists and graduate students found his proposals for a behavioral psychology appealing, arguing that Watson was cleansing psychology's muddled atmosphere by casting out long-standing mysteries carried over from philosophy. Mary Cover Jones, from 1896 to 1987, then a graduate student and later president of the APA's Division of Developmental Psychology, recalled the excitement that greeted the publication of each of Watson's books. Quote, Watson's behaviorism shook the foundations of traditional European-bred psychology, and we welcomed it. It pointed the way from armchair psychology to action and reform and was therefore hailed as a panacea. End quote. Older psychologists usually were not so captivated by Watson's program. However, most of them rejected his approach. Only 2 years after the publication of the Psychological Review article, Watson was indeed elected president of the APA. His election may not have been representative, may not have represented an official endorsement of his position as much as it served as recognition of his visibility and the personal network that he had established with many prominent psychologists. He wanted his new behaviorism to be of practical value. His ideas were not only for the laboratory, but for the real world as well. He promoted psychology's applied specialties and became a personal consultant for a large insurance company. He also offered a course for business students at Hopkins on the psychology of advertising and started a program to train graduate students to work in industrial psychology. During World War I, Watson served as a major in the United States Army, developing perceptual and motor ability tests to be used as selection devices for pilots. He conducted research on how pilots are affected by the reduced oxygen at high altitudes and produced a film designed to warn soldiers about the dangers of sexually transmitted diseases. A British psychologist noted wryly that Watson, quote, gave thought, not very successfully it seems, on how to stimulate soldiers to refrain from sex, end quote. After the war, however, Watson and a physician established the Industrial Service Corporation to provide personnel selection and management consulting assistance to the business world. Despite his activities in these applied psychology areas, Watson's focus remained on developing his behaviorist approach to psychological thought. In 1919, he published a book titled Psychology from the Standpoint of a Behaviorist, which he dedicated to Cattell. In the book, he presented a more complete statement of his behavioral psychology and argued that the methods and principles he had recommended for animal psychology were also appropriate for the study of humans. Okay, at this time, Watson's marriage deteriorated. Around 1919, his many infidelities made his wife furious. He wrote to Engel that Mary no longer cared for him. Quote, "She instinctively loathes my touch. Have not we made a mess of our lives?" End quote. He was about to make an even greater mess. He fell in love with Rosalie Rayner and wrote toward, if somewhat scientifically worded, love letters, 15 of which his wife took from Rosalie's dresser drawer in her bedroom. During the sensational divorce trial that followed, excerpts of the letters were printed in the Baltimore Sun newspaper. One of them read, "Every cell I have is yours, individually and collectively. My total reactions are positive and toward you. So likewise each and every heart reaction. I cannot be more yours than I am, even if a surgical operation made us one." Thus ended Watson's promising university career. He was forced to resign from Johns Hopkins, an act that, quote, "almost certainly altered the history of American psychology," end quote. A biographer also wrote, quote, "Watson was stunned. Until the end, he had refused to believe that he would actually be fired. He had been convinced that his professional stature would have rendered him impervious to any censure of his private life," end quote. Although he married Rosalie Rayner, he was never allowed to return to a full-time academic position. Because of the notoriety, no university would have him, and he soon realized he would have to make a new life. Quote, "I can find a commercial job," he wrote, "but I frankly love my work. I feel that my work is important for psychology, and that the tiny flame which I have tried to keep burning for the future of psychology will be snuffed out if I go," end quote. Many academic colleagues, including his mentor Engel at the University of Chicago, publicly criticized Watson. He was bitter about the lack of support, believing they were somehow disloyal. Ironically, considering their radically different temperaments and theoretical positions, it was E.B. Titchener at Cornell who provided emotional sustenance for Watson during this personal crisis. Quote, "I am terribly sorry for the Watson children," Titchener wrote to Robert Yerkes. "Just as I am sorry for Watson himself. He will have to disappear for 5 or 10 years, I am afraid, if he ever wants to return to psychology," end quote. So, here we see that respect is hard to earn, but it is easily lost and hard to gain back once it is lost. So, unemployed and ordered to pay 2/3 of his former salary in alimony and child support, Watson began a new career as an applied psychologist in the field of advertising. He joined the J. Walter Thompson Advertising Agency in the year 1921 for an annual salary of $25,000, which was 4 times his academic salary. He conducted house-to-house surveys, sold coffee, and clerked in Macy's department store to learn about the business world. Acting with his characteristic ingenuity and drive, he became a vice president within 3 years. He joined another advertising agency in 1936, where he remained until his retirement in 1945. Watson believed that human behavior was like that of machines. Therefore, the behavior of people as consumers of goods and services could be predicted and controlled, just like the behavior of other machines. To control a consumer, he said, quote, "It is only necessary to confront him or her with either fundamental or conditional emotional stimuli. Tell him or her something that will tie them up with fear, something that will stir up a mild rage, that will call out an affectionate or love response, or strike at a deep psychological or habit need." End quote. He proposed laboratory studies of consumer behavior. He stressed that advertising messages should focus on style rather than substance and should convey the impression of a new and improved image. The purpose was to make consumers dissatisfied with the products they were using and to instill the desire for new goods. For many years, Watson was credited with pioneering the use of celebrity endorsements of products and services and for devising techniques to manipulate our motives and emotions. Later research showed that although he strongly promoted these techniques, they were already in use before he joined the advertising world. Nevertheless, Watson's contributions to advertising were highly effective and soon brought him prominence and wealth. He wore clothing hand-tailored in England and by 1930 was earning $70,000 a year. That is equivalent to about $1 million today in the 21st century. Of course, after 1920, Watson had only indirect contact with academic psychology. Instead, he presented his ideas for behavioral psychology to the general public through lectures, talks on radio, and articles in popular magazines, thus increasing his visibility. In one article written for popular consumption was, for example, he predicted the end of the institution of marriage. He said that, quote, monogamy is passing, I believe. The social mechanism has slipped its trolley. We are unfettered and unshackled and are romping and frolicking in our freedom, end quote. If Watson was out to shock people, then he was succeeding. In his magazine articles, Watson conveyed the more serious message of behaviorism to a wide audience. His writing style was clear, readable, and somewhat simplistic. In his autobiography, he commented that although his work was no longer acceptable to the professional psychology journals, there was no reason why he should not sell his wares to the public. This attitude alienated him even more from the academic community. Quote, those who were not particularly tolerant of the application of psychological principles more generally, or of the behaviorist doctrine itself, were even less tolerant of Watson's campaigns to spread the doctrine, end quote. A rare formal contact with academic psychology came through a series of lectures Watson delivered at New York's New School for Social Research, but his appointment there did not last long. He was dismissed because of alleged sexual misconduct, though the charges were never made public. Other outlets for Watson's views became available, however. The lectures at the New School formed the basis of his book titled Behaviorism, which described his program for the improvement of society. The book was first published in the year 1925, and Watson later admitted that it had been hastily prepared. Quote, my lectures were taken down in shorthand, and then I looked over them and rushed them to the publisher. End quote. A more polished version was released in 1930. Both editions were immensely successful, the one in 1925 and the polished one in 1930. And Watson's ideas reached a large number of people outside the realm of psychology. In 1928, Watson published Psychological Care of the Infant and Child, in which he severely criticized the child rearing practices of the day. He charged that, quote, parents today are incompetent. Most of them should be indicted for psychological murder, end quote. He proposed a regulatory rather than a permissive system of child rearing, in keeping with his strong environmentalist position. The book was full of stern advice on the behaviorist way to bring up children. According to Watson, parents should never, quote, hug and kiss them. Never let them sit on your lap. If you must kiss them once on the forehead when they say goodnight, shake hands with them in the morning. Give them a pat on the head if they have made an extraordinarily good job of a difficult task. You will find how easy it is to be perfectly objective with your child, and at the same time kindly. You will be utterly ashamed at the mawkish, sentimental way you have been handling it, end quote. A brief note on Watson's children. Watson's book was also extremely popular, and it transformed American child-rearing practices. A generation of children, including his own, was raised in accordance with these prescriptions. Watson's son James, a California businessman, recalled that his father was unable to show affection to him and his brother. He described Watson as, quote, unresponsive, emotionally uncommunicative, unable to express and cope with any feelings or emotions of his own, and determined unwittingly to deprive, I think, my brother and me of any kind of emotional foundation. He deeply believed that any expression of tenderness or affection would have a harmful effect on us. He was very rigid in carrying out his fundamental philosophies as a behaviorist. We were never kissed or held as children. We were never shown any kind of emotional closeness. It was absolutely verboten in the family. When I went to bed at night, I recall shaking hands with my parents. I never tried, nor did my brother Billy, to ever get close to our parents physically because we both knew it was taboo. End quote. What a terrible life that he had to go through because of Watson's behavior. But anyways, Watson's wife Rosalie wrote an article for Parents Magazine titled "I Am the Mother of a Behaviorist's Sons," in which she publicly disagreed with his child-rearing practices. In some respects, she wrote, I bow to the great wisdom in the science of behaviorism, and in others I am rebellious. I secretly wish that on the score of the children's affections, they will be a little weak when they grow up, that they will have a tear in their eyes for the poetry and drama of life, and a throb for romance. I like being merry and gay and having the giggles. The behaviorists think giggling is a sign of maladjustment. End quote. Rosalie also contended that she found it difficult to restrain completely her affection for her children and occasionally wanted to break the behaviorist rules. However, her son James could not recall that ever happening. Both sons suffered serious depression throughout adolescence and adulthood. As a result, one son committed suicide, the other had a mental collapse, fighting his own suicidal impulses. Although he survived, his daughter took her life some years later. In addition, Watson's daughter by his first marriage made several suicide attempts. Quote, "I've always been suicidal," she told her daughter. The depression began during the divorce scandal in Baltimore. End quote. Her daughter, the actress Mariette Hartley, also suffered from depression, alcoholism, and suicidal thoughts. She noted that, quote, "There wasn't exactly a plethora of physical affection in our family." End quote. It appears that Watson's behavioral approach to child rearing was not exactly a success in his personal life. His son James wrote years later that, quote, "I honestly believe the principles for which Dad stood as a behaviorist eroded both Bill's and my ability to deal effectively with human emotions, and it tended to undermine self-esteem in later life, ultimately contributing to Bill's death and my own crisis. Tragically, that's the antithesis of what Dad expected from practicing these philosophies." End quote. Very ironic as well. Watson published several articles in popular magazines revealing his attitudes toward women, particularly those who fought for causes such as women's right to vote. He said that such behavior, or that such women were sexually dissatisfied, which explained what he called their strident behavior. Quote, "Most of the terrible women one must meet, women with the blatant views and voices, women who have to be noticed, who shoulder one about, who can't take life quietly, belong to this large percentage of women who have never made a sex adjustment." End quote. He added that militancy in women would be overcome as soon as they found appropriate sexual satisfaction, when they would become docile, quiet, satisfied with their lives and their roles in society. Watson also wrote that women lose their sexual appeal at age 30 and are totally over the hill by age 40, especially if they have children. In contrast, Watson noted that men retain their vigor and attractiveness well into their 40s. Quote, "Men take better care of themselves and stay trim, while their mates become fat, waddling, and fatuous." End quote. Not exactly a subtle comment on gender. Watson was definitely a misogynist, and perhaps he was a womanizer as well. Watson was intelligent, articulate, handsome, and charming, and it was those qualities that made him a celebrity. He was often in the public eye, courting and relishing the attention. He raced speedboats and mingled easily with the cream of New York society. He considered himself a romantic adventurer and liked to take on challengers in drinking bouts. He built a mansion in Connecticut and staffed it with servants, yet he enjoyed dressing in old clothes and doing his own yard work. Watson was very concerned with many activities, for example, hunting, fishing, and other ways in which adults and children should demonstrate their courage and personal capabilities. In that way, he had a Hemingway-like aura about him, for he valued competency, bravery, and manliness. And that is from James Watson himself. In spite of all his celebrity, success, and wealth, Watson experienced periodic bouts of depression. In 1933, to try to cope with one such episode, he began a study of suicide. He asked a sample of 50 people to write essays on why they did not commit suicide. He found their answers depressing, because the majority of them gave only negative responses to the question. Very few stated positive reasons for wanting to continuing living. He described the results in an article for Cosmopolitan magazine, which rejected it as being too depressing. In 1935, Rosalie died at the age of 37. James Watson recalled that this was the only time he ever saw his father cry. For a brief moment, Watson hugged his sons, the only affection they could recall. He then sent them off to boarding school and never spoke of Rosalie to them again. When Myrtle McGraw, a psychologist in New York, ran into Watson not long afterward, he told her how unprepared he was to deal with Rosalie's death. Because he was 20 years older, he had always assumed he would die first. He talked to McGraw at some length, questioning how he would cope with his grief. He soon became a recluse, shutting himself off from social contact and plunging into his work. He sold the big house and moved to a wooden farmhouse that resembled his boyhood home. In 1957, when Watson was 79, the APA awarded him a citation praising his work as, quote, one of the vital determinants of the form and substance of modern psychology, the point of departure for continuing lines of fruitful research, end quote. A friend drove Watson to the New York hotel where the presentation was to be held. But at the last minute, Watson refused to go inside and insisted that his eldest son attend in his stead. Watson was afraid that in that moment his emotions would overwhelm him, that the apostle of behavior control would break down and weep. Before Watson died the following year, he burned every one of his letters, manuscripts, and notes, feeding them into the fireplace one by one, refusing to leave them to history. The best way to begin our coverage of Watson's behaviorist school of thought is to read an excerpt from the article that launched the movement. In the following passage from his Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, Watson discussed the definition and goal of his new psychology and criticizes the structuralist and functionalist schools. He also explains his view that areas of applied psychology can be considered scientific because they attempt to find general laws for the prediction and control of behavior. Thank you for watching this first part on John B. Watson. And the second reading, we will go over Watson's actual work. Thank you.